Hi, welcome to Life in a Bottle, Season 2, Episode 26. I'm Kyle, joined by Cody and another special guest this week, Tim Malone. Tim Malone is joining us from Oregon today.
Before we get started, I was just wondering, could you tell us a little bit about where you've worked so far and how Tim Malone Wine came to be?
Yeah, so originally, I was working at Fountainhead Wines and Fat Cat Pie Company in Norwalk, Connecticut. Via those guys, I was able to build relationships in Oregon with John Paul from Cameron and Jay Summers from J. Christopher Wines. And so starting with I set up a harvest for 2006, not really having any plans for afterwards, but drove out to Oregon, worked harvest for Jay Summers at J. Christopher. And then after that, I was able to get set up working growing season at Cameron Winery, which was still one of the best things I ever got to do. You know, John Paul is just a great guy to work for. And also really gave me a good foundation of understanding what goes on in the vineyard, because I worked the vineyard pretty much exclusively for the entire growing season. After that,
I hear those wines are pretty good.
Yeah, they're all right. We'll make sure John Paul sees that. After that, I briefly went down to California. I had a buddy of mine who was the viticulturist at Flowers down in the Sonoma coast. I loved the wines. I loved the area. It just wasn't really my style, Portland and Oregon was still just a little bit more rustic, maybe a little bit more young, a little bit more communal. So I quickly made my way back up to Oregon, where I started working with Jay Summers, basically eventually becoming his assistant in 2010. We had moved into a new winery, and then 2012, I got the go-ahead to start making my own wine while I was still currently the assistant winemaker at J. Christopher, which is a pretty logical step for a winemaker, assistant winemaker out here. And then by 2015, July of 2015, I left J. Christopher Wines and moved into Medici Vineyards, the current facility I'm making my wine in. That's the fast story, and so still there now. Next step is to hopefully get my own place. I would like to be out of co-op and kind of have my own winery, and specifically, I would love to get some grapes in the dirt. Have my own thing that I could farm. That would be kind of ideal. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's the nitty gritty of how Timothy Malone Wines came to be.
So obviously, we're starting out in Oregon,
and we're more specifically in the Willamette Valley. And this comes from Cancilla Vineyard. Could you tell us specifically where Cancilla is, Tim?
Yeah, Cancilla Vineyard is located just north of Cherry Grove, which is the northwestern Willamette Valley, up start getting close to the coastal range. So it is just north of the Yamhill-Carlton AVA.
Gotcha. And what we are tasting is Timmy's 2018 Cancilla Vineyard Chardonnay. Could you tell us a little bit about the site itself, Tim?
Yeah, so the site itself is southeast facing. It does gradually swing over to a southwestern exposure. It's about 500 to 600 feet elevation. It's a mixture of a little bit of ancient seabed material, but mostly volcanic material. It's planted in 1999 to 2005 to 19 acres of Pinot Noir, 1 acre of Chardonnay. Specifically, since we're talking about the Chardonnay, the clonal material is Dijon clone, so clone 76 and 95. Both of which are rooted on the 3309 rootstock. Pretty straightforward plantings for the valley here in terms of clonal material and rootstock. But fortunately, Chardonnay, like Pinot Noir, is very reflective of the site that it comes from. It really represents microclimates well. So,
could you maybe just say a few words on how you approached the winemaking this year, and if at all, did it differ from what you did last year in 2017?
So most of it stayed the same. One thing I did maybe a little different is, long story short, I press it whole cluster. I settle it for an evening, and then I rack the clean juice to barrel. In an attempt to make it a little bit more reductive, I took a little bit of the heavy lees from the bottom that had settled out, which does a couple things. One, it provides a little bit of food for the yeast, but too much of it could produce an overly reductive wine. So you really want to be careful. I did put some of that heavy lees back in to help feed the fermentation, also to help create a slightly more reductive environment. At the same time, I also exposed it to much more air. So pre-fermentation oxidation, that does two things. One, it, in theory, it helps create a better mouthfeel later on. Two, it also exposes all the elements that would oxidize later in a wine. It pre-oxidizes all those and lets them precipitate out prior to a wine fermenting or being bottled, so that you don't have to worry as much about oxidation down the line. Other than that, the barrel program was a little different. With the 17, we had in one very large barrel. I didn't have enough juice in 18 to use that barrel again, so I went into two used Francois Frere barrels that I had actually picked up from Walter Scott Wines just a couple months prior to vintage. So kinetics of the fermentation were a little different, being in a smaller barrel. It won't get as warm. Also, it's not quite as reductive as a large barrel would be. But native fermentation, low and slow. I think the fermentation on the 18s took just in excess of 12 months. I still have an 18 barrel that hasn't finished primary fermentation yet. It's really, really close, but I'm all in on the long and slow fermentations. You know,
That's super cool.
You know, every once in a while, if you think you're getting a tiny bit of VA in the headspace, you can just stir the lees. Lees are magical. I mean, they'll just eat up oxygen, and you know, you don't want to stir it up to a point where you're really kind of trying to build a lot of texture. You're really just doing it to help preserve the wine. But otherwise,
so what's the plan for that barrel?
it has Chardonnay in it from a different site right now. So in 18, we picked up an additional site called Nicholas Vineyard that belongs to a winery called Anam Cara. So right now I had enough juice from that site to fill both the 700 liter and the 500 liter. And then in 19, jumping ahead even farther now, we picked up an additional used 500 liter. So we're growing the large format program, you know. As long as we get enough juice, of course, obviously, you still have to have the 220s. But, you know, I like the idea of big barrels. The wine just tends to be safer. You don't have to pay attention to it as much. You can use less sulfur. And it's just different kinetics to the fermentation.
Tim, you once shared with me that there was a particular benchmark experience that maybe inspired you to make some Chardonnay.
We've got this little storage place here in Portland. It's where I keep my personal wine stored, as well as stuff for the company I have to deliver in town. And so there's a lot of guys there who have cellars, very deep cellars. And so I stop in every once in a while. Usually on a Wednesday evening, these guys get together. At least pre-pandemic, they get together, and you know, all of a sudden they opened up a Ramonet 07 Chassagne Montrachet, and they're like, "Here, you got to try some of this," you know. And I'm like, "Okay," you know, if you insist, you know. And the wine blew my mind. I mean, I was floored. I've had some good Chardonnays in my day, and I worked for Cameron, and I love John Paul's Chardonnays, but that wine definitely blew my mind. I was just, I was so floored by all the elements of that wine, especially in how well it was showing for an 07. This was probably 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. So, you know, it had 10 plus years on it. I couldn't believe how fresh it was and how much life it still had left in it. It was pretty incredible experience, you know.
Well, Tim, I gotta say, I know you have not cracked the 2018 from bottle yet, but the wine is singing, and it's definitely got a Burgundian feel.
Awesome.
Super stony, and just glowing. I love it. What do you think, Kyle?
Almost a tiny bit Chablisy. It's so clean. It's super focused. It's got that texture that you were talking about hunting for. And it's got just that little bit of creaminess to it, but it's pristine. It's that clean lemon and lime with just that tiny hint of pith. It's not bitter and cloying at all. It's really, really singing. It's absolutely gorgeous. give me another afternoon like this or two and some oysters. I'm good.
Perfect.
You know,
Perfect.
I was thinking buttery clams, like right off the grill, like little dip of butter.
Oh. Yeah, now you're talking.
This would be a happy pairing.
I wouldn't be mad at that either.
I'm glad you guys like it. Chardonnay is still relatively new for my label, but I did get a chance to obviously work for some good Chardonnay makers here in the Valley in the past, notably John Paul and working with Tyson Crowley, and Jay Christopher. He wasn't known for making a lot of Chardonnay, but we did make a little bit of Chardonnay in-house that was really quite good. And I don't know, I guess I'm still trying to find my way too on exactly how I'm going to differentiate myself. What am I bringing to the conversation? So
this wine makes me pretty happy right now.
Yeah,
well,
I think
glad
you're
to hear it,
really approaching dialed.
Well, I also feel like that's the great. I had great opportunities to work for great winemakers, so it's not like I'm reinventing the wheel by myself. I get to build upon what they've already accomplished, so I took everything I could learn from them, kind of start there, hopefully, and then just hopefully keep progressing, that's the idea.
I mean, it's like you were saying before, there's so much, or when we were discussing the various scientific aspects of winemaking and then talking about stylistic choices, that's really why it's so easy to fall in love with wine. And that's what we're to see is I work for a company. I'm super blessed to be able to work somewhere where I get exposure to all these different styles and all these different wines. And for us to be able to pass that along to the customer and to see Chardonnay in however many 20 different styles that it can be done, it's awesome.
Yeah.
So be able to bring stuff like this to the party is beautifully done. Happy to have
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
thanks for coming
again,
out today, Tim. This is
beautiful.
It's awesome wine. Awesome time.
Oh yeah, man, my pleasure.
Yeah,
I'm glad you guys are getting in on it. You got a chunk of it too. There was 47 and a half cases, and I think 40 of them went to New York, Connecticut. So,
wow.
Well, thanks guys. I appreciate it.
And thanks again.
Cheers, Tim.
Good seeing you.
Good to see you, man. Be well.
You too.